The sides form up again.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with violence in the Middle East that some people regard as inevitable and others as a tragedy. In the Gaza Strip today, where Palestinians have only recently been given authority over their own lives, the first national Palestinian police force and Palestinian civilians found themselves in an out-of-control situation. This was a combination of dangerous Palestinian politics, a lack of respect for the new Palestinian Authority, and an inexperienced Palestinian police force firing into a crowd. More than a dozen people are dead and at least 120 wounded. ABC's Dean Reynolds is there.
The Palestinian police were trying to block a protest at Gaza's largest mosque today. The worshippers here had intended to rally after their prayers, but the police took away their loudspeakers. And that's when somebody threw a stone at the men in uniform. What followed was a bloody all-day battle between the Muslim faithful of Hamas and the heavily armed forces of Yasser Arafat. Tension between the two sides over the peace with Israel, which Hamas despises, has been building for weeks. Today, it exploded. The PLO police were not firing rubber bullets favored by the Israeli soldiers who left here not long ago. They were shooting lead at their own people. Hospital officials said many of the casualties were hit in the chest. Some Arafat aides conceded the police may well have been looking for a showdown with Hamas. It clearly backfired. Is this your peace, Arafat? The demonstrators chanted outside the hospital. Jails and arrests. Crowds of protesters converged on the city jail, where more than 100 Islamic activists are behind bars on Arafat's explicit orders, held as suspects in a number of murderous attacks on Israelis. The riot here today is the most serious challenge to Arafat since he took control in Gaza last July, and it bolsters the argument some Israelis have been making for a long time, that if the PLO cannot control Gaza, the experiment in Palestinian self-rule must end right here. The chaotic scenes today will surely dim the enthusiasm foreign donors may have for giving money to this place. If that creates further poverty in the process, Hamas is likely to win desperate converts. The PLO chairman who prayed at a mosque this morning before the rioting erupted remains caught between Hamas and the Israelis. If he sides with the Israelis and continues to crack down on militants, his support here is likely to erode even more. But if he sides with Hamas, he will definitely lose the Israelis and any hope of a Palestinian state worth leading. As Palestinians were looking down the barrels of their own guns today, they may well have seen a future that looked very much like their bitter past. It's just like the Jews, said one woman watching the bloodshed. No, said a man, it's worse. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Gaza.
The war in Bosnia was particularly fierce today. Neither the United Nations nor the NATO alliance did anything about it. In Sarajevo, declared a safe zone by the United Nations, the Serbian snipers got a 7-year-old boy, shot him in the head. In the scramble for safety, his mother was hit too.
She is hurt.
Another frantic effort in the hospital to save a life or at least a limb. Another sister who has lost her brother, another mother who has lost her son. The fighting in Bosnia was severe on a number of fronts today. The United Nations and NATO are watching for now. Here's ABC's John McWethy.
Everywhere you looked in Bosnia today, including Sarajevo, UN safe areas looked anything but safe.
The situation is deteriorating a bit. The security situation is getting worse and worse.
In the Bosnian city of Bihać, 2 Serb aircraft violated the UN-declared no-fly zone and dropped bombs.
Cluster and napalm bombs have been in fact used in this attack against the civilian residents of Bihać.
Intelligence sources say Serb troops surrounding Bihać, another so-called safe zone, appeared ready to overwhelm the city. 170,000 Bosnian civilians are trapped. So are 1,200 UN peacekeepers from Bangladesh. The UN was so disorganized it put the troops into Bihać before equipping them. Only 1 of every 6 has a weapon. In a week, they will run out of food. In Washington today, there was enormous frustration among U.S. and NATO officials at the seeming paralysis of the UN. The reluctance of the UN operation in Bosnia, called UNPROFOR, to ask for airstrikes.
We need to continually stress that UNPROFOR needs to call more on the NATO resources to use NATO's air power.
There cannot be airstrikes without both NATO and the UN agreeing, a so-called double key system.
There is not an inability of NATO, sir, but there is a double key. So we can take decisions on action if the UN is not asking for it.
American officials are exploring ways to change the rigid rules that limit how NATO air power is used in Bosnia, but admit they are not optimistic the UN will allow any change. John McWethy, ABC News, the Pentagon.
While the Bosnian government's forces are very much under siege in the northwest, in the center of the country, with only one reporter as a witness, the predominantly Muslim forces are giving the Serbian troops a very difficult time on a very important supply route. ABC's Tony Bertley is the reporter.
For the first time in this war, the Bosnian army is at least matching the Serbs with heavy weapons, using artillery, rocket and anti-aircraft guns.
The aim is to take two villages overlooking the Serb-held town of Donji Vakuf.
A Bosnian army victory at Donji Vakuf would open the way to vital supply routes to northwest Bosnia, where the army is fighting the Bosnian Serbs. The Bosnian soldiers here believe they will soon recapture their homes for the first time in 2.5 years.
I think we have broken them and are close to Donji Vakuf. 10 days, not more.
The Serbs are putting up stiff resistance, but the Bosnians believe their flag will soon be flying, at least in this part of the country. Tony Bertley, ABC News, Central Bosnia.
When we come back, some of the day's other news, the battle that is shaping up over prayer in the schools, the day in court for Susan Smith, charged with murdering her 2 children, and our person of the week, a modern master. The Clinton administration is scrambling somewhat today, trying to define where it really stands on prayer in the public schools. This is partly a reaction to the new Republican power in the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich and others want a constitutional amendment which would make public prayer permissible. First, the president said he would be willing to talk about it, which set off alarm bells among many Democrats, which led the administration to pedal backwards. We have several reports on school prayer. First, ABC's Jackie Judd.
To an audience of American Jews, the vice president seemed to rule out support for a school prayer amendment.
The president and I are both adamantly opposed to allowing government to take over responsibility for telling our children how to pray.
The president, aides say, favors legislation permitting a moment of silence in school. That's different from the out-loud voluntary prayer envisioned by some Republicans, including Congressman Ernest Istook, who's leading the drive to get an amendment passed.
A prayer is something that is positive. A prayer is something that expresses the best of American traditions and beliefs.
Even before the Republican landslide, Congressman Istook and 44 other Republicans introduced a resolution proposing a constitutional amendment legalizing school prayer, but leaving the details up to local school districts.
I think it's important to understand that we are talking about voluntary school prayer. We're not talking about any form of compulsion. We're not talking about a government-composed prayer.
Istook believes passage is likely, but a 2/3 vote is needed in the House and in the Senate, after which 37 state legislatures would have to ratify the amendment. If it gets that far, it will be a long process. House Republicans say the first test of strength for this controversial idea will come shortly before July the 4th. What better time than the nation's birthday, they say, to debate what they view as a basic American right. Jackie Judd, ABC News, Washington.
We're going to put this whole subject on the American agenda tonight. 32 years ago, the Supreme Court set the stage for this struggle. The court ruled that even non-denominational prayer recited voluntarily in New York's public schools was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has been solidly opposed to school prayer ever since, which is why supporters of school prayer are now trying to go over the court's head to amend the Constitution itself. Here's our religious affairs correspondent, Peggy Wehmeyer.
They lifted their voices in jubilant praise.
School children across the country will recreate the first Thanksgiving this week, but these pilgrims won't be praying. Some religious conservatives say that has to change.
13-year-olds are having babies, and 15-year-olds are shooting up, and 17-year-olds are killing each other. And I think the feeling is that if a moment of prayer at the beginning of the day would help just one child realize that they're loved by God, that then it would be worth going through this political battle and doing it.
Many religious leaders, including Catholics, Muslims, and evangelicals, say they don't expect a 30-second prayer to reverse moral decay, but they do consider it a symbolic move away from secularism and toward wholesome values. Many African-American pastors are among the most outspoken school prayer advocates.
With the violence that is every day recorded in our public schools, that there is a need within this community for a spiritual base.
But many mainline Protestant ministers say prayer belongs within families and faith communities, not as a requirement in public schools.
If they're coerced, my fear is that it will be bad for religion. It will be bad for Christians because they may feel an aversion to faith instead of being drawn to it.
But the Jewish community is especially concerned about a prayer amendment.
It's tyrannical to the minority. Either our kids have to step outside the room, be quiet, understand that they are different and outside the majority. It says you don't belong.
But advocates for school prayer say they have been unfairly silenced for too long. This is Peggy Waymeyer for the American Agenda.
This is Rebecca Chase in Marietta, Georgia, where school opens with a moment of silence every day.
May I have your attention, please, for a moment of quiet reflection.
In Georgia, a law makes the moment of silence mandatory. The act of prayer is voluntary.
I just remain silent. I don't pray during that time.
I feel that everyone should have the opportunity to express their religious beliefs.
Georgia's moment of silence law was instigated not by Christian conservatives, but by liberal Democrats as a way to help combat violence in the schools.
It is secular in its nature and its purpose, but yet and still, it can serve the purpose of those who are so disposed of to want to pray.
Even though the president seems to favor a similar measure, today's speaker-to-be Newt Gingrich, speaking to students here, made it clear that a moment of silence law would not satisfy him.
I think children should actually be allowed to pray. I think that prayer is different than silence, and that it's a very serious question. I think we need to have hearings on it in the spring.
Give us to say our daily bread.
Still, the fact remains that voluntary prayer laws recently passed in a number of states continue to be contested in the courts. But Georgia and South Carolina's mandatory moment of silence laws so far have not been challenged. This is Rebecca Chase for the American Agenda.
And one note about the midterm elections. In California today, Senator Dianne Feinstein said there are no longer enough absentee ballots left to count to change the outcome, and she has claimed victory over her challenger, Michael Huffington, in the race for the Senate. When we come back, Susan Smith in court.